Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to the start of a brand new layout building series. If you've seen the trailer, you'll know that this time round I'm going to be building a TT120 layout, and you may have also seen that this series has very kindly been sponsored by the Model Centre. It's really exciting to have them on board this time round, and more about them later on in the video. Now, TT120 is a fairly new scale, in the UK at least, and it sits somewhere between 00 gauge and N gauge. The idea is that it's much smaller than 00, but not quite as fiddly as N gauge, so it's a nice middle ground between the two. This time round as well, I'm not actually going to be building a layout for myself, it's going to be for my dad, who saw the TT Easterner set last year and picked one up. Now, he's challenged me to build him a layout, which is basically a more exciting way of saying I'm free labour. Eventually, this new layout is going to live in his home office, but it is going to do one exhibition first. That will be the Spa Valley Railway's Model Railway Weekend in September down in Tunbridge Wells. So, if you follow along with this series, you'll also be able to come and see the hopefully finished layout in person later this year. That does give me a bit of a deadline though, and as if that wasn't enough, my dad has also given me several requirements for what he wants to be included on this layout. First off is a double track mainline loop so that he can have two trains running continuously all the time. In addition to this, he also wants a shunting yard so that while trains are running around the main loop, he can assemble freight trains in the sidings without affecting the other trains. He also doesn't want any fiddle yard because he sees those as a waste of space, so instead he wants a large terminus station where he can store trains before running them. He also wants a tunnel and the railway to run over a bridge too, and finally he wants an upper level so that sometimes the trains are elevated above the baseboard level. So quite a lot to pack in, but handily we do at least have a name for the layout, which is going to be called Teton. You know, because it's TT and yeah, you get the idea. Anyway, fitting all this in, even in TT, is going to be quite a challenge, but I've been working hard on a design and let me show you what I've come up with. So this design has been through a lot of different iterations, but I'm actually really happy with how this has turned out. The baseboard is 8 foot by 2.5 foot, which in 00 gauge would be quite tight for continuous running, but with TT it gives me a lot more space to play with. Now, the two main circuits are the easy bit since they pretty much speak for themselves. You'll notice that I've added a crossover along the front so that trains can move from the outer circuit to the inner one, and additionally on the right hand side I'm not using the full width or depth of the board here, which does make the radius on the curves quite tight, especially on the inner one, which is just under second radius. This is probably the bit of the layout I'm most worried about, but it was necessary because round the outside of this is going to be a third line rising up on an incline before it crosses over the main line on a bridge. This leads to the upper level where there'll be a town scene featuring a 3-platform station plus a couple of sidings for holding locomotives when not in use. And the general idea is that trains can depart from the station, head down the incline onto the main line and then run round either of the two circuits. But what about when they want to get back up to the station? It seems a bit silly for them to have to reverse back up the incline, so I've put in a cut through which connects the two sides of the inner loop together. This is effectively a reversing loop so that trains can change their direction and travel back up to the station normally. Here the leading loco can be detached, ready for another loco facing the right direction to take over the train. And then to finish off, I've used this space in front of the upper level to create a small shunting yard. With the included head shunt, this is essentially an inglenook shunting puzzle, which can be operated completely separate from the main line. So you can have two trains running around the main circuits, while also shunting a goods train in this yard here before sending it up to the station. It all works on paper, but will that translate to reality when I start laying the track? Well, there's only one way to find out. Here is the baseboard all constructed and ready to go. It really is a blank canvas and it does feel like I've got a lot of space to work with. I'll be using PECO's TT track for this project so that I can make use of their flexible track sections. They've also got this very clever way of embedding the rails slightly into the sleeper, which makes the track look a lot finer, so visually this should look really good when it's all ballasted. I'm going to start off with the most complex part of the track plan, which is this 4-point junction right at the very front of the layout. Everything else very much depends on the position of this section, so while I would have preferred to start with something a bit more simple, this really has to be the first part to go in. I'm using cork underlay as a base for the track to sit on, which is glued in place using neat PVA. This will not only be a nice base for the track to sit on, but eventually it'll also give the ballast a bit of a shoulder too. The points will all be operated by motors underneath the board, so here I'm marking out the position of the tie bar. Unlike double O gauge points, with TT the hole for the motor arm is on the side of the tie bar rather than in the centre. A hole is then drilled through the surface of the wood. I'm also using uni-frog points on this build for the very first time, and these allow you to switch the polarity of the frog, so I'm going to drill a hole for the feed wire to pass through as well. Because this whole section is right at the very front of the baseboard, the two front points are sitting over the wood that makes up the frame. As a result, I can't put the motors directly underneath them, so instead I'm going to use the wire in tube method to allow remote operation. With a section of cork cut away, the tubing can slot down into this gap, which will allow the wire to pass under the inside track without interference. It's time to lay the first points though, and for this I'm actually going to use double-sided tape. This stuff is normally intended for sticking down carpets, so it should be perfectly capable of holding a couple of points in place. The feeder wires on the frogs are pushed through the holes I drilled earlier, and the points are then stuck down. The same is then done for the next point along too. This time I use a modelling knife to poke holes in the tape where the motor and feeder holes are. The point can then be laid, joining it up to the two on the front of the layout. Next, I drill a couple of holes further back from the points, and this will be where the motors are situated for the front 2 points. Here I've got some piano wire, which you can see I've bent to a right angle at one end. The 1mm wire is then inserted into the 2mm tubing before the right angle is hooked into the tie bar of the point. The wire and tube then sits down into the groove I cut earlier, and because the tube is the same height as the cork, it's all nice and flush. It's hard to see here, but the tubing is static while I push the wire inside back and forth, which of course operates the point mechanism. The same method is then used for the second point too. And with the tubing now in place, I can lay the double-sided tape for the final point. Now, if you're thinking about building a TT layout of your own, well, you'll need a lot of track, points, and fish plates to get you started. And that's where our sponsor for this series, the Model Center, comes in. All of the track I've been laying in this video was ordered from TMC, and it arrived really quickly too, so I was able to go from finalizing the design to actually laying track within the space of a day or two. The Model Center are also one of the retailers who stock all of Hornby's TT range as well. So if you fancy picking up a starter set or maybe adding an extra loco or some rolling stock to your collection, well, they've got everything available and you get a bit of a discount off the RRP too, which is nice. You can check out the full range on their website, tmcdirect.com. There's a link to that in the description too. And yeah, thank you so much to the Model Center for sponsoring this series. With the junction at the front all laid, I can now start to work on the curves immediately after them, and I'm starting out by putting down some PVA. The cork base is then added again along the path of the curve. I've actually cut the cork into 2 long strips here, which allows me to bend them more easily to follow the curve. I'm starting on the inner curve now, with the cork being laid right up to that second tubing run I showed earlier. It doesn't matter if I get glue on the tube, in fact I want this to be held in place as only the wire inside needs to move. I then continue laying the cork round the curve. Something else I'm trying to be aware of as well is maintaining the same distance between the 2 lines. Once all the cork is laid, I'll then weigh all of this down while I let it dry. Before I lay the track, I'll first mark a rough position where the 2 power feeds will go. I'll then drill 2 holes through the surface of the baseboard to correspond with these marks. 2 feeder wires, which I've soldered to my rails, are then pushed through the holes, and then the track itself can be slotted into place. With the track in roughly the right position, I can then start to tack it in place. With the outer line now going in, you may notice that the distance between these 2 tracks is really close for these tight curves. Unfortunately, they have to be so close in order to allow the inner line to have a smoother, wider curve. It is very close, but if I've done my calculations correctly, trains shouldn't hit each other as they pass on this section, even with the overhang on longer coaches. I will admit though, it's on the absolute limit, but this is the tightest section of the entire layout. It's time to add track along the front of the layout now, and once again I'm starting out by adding PVA to the surface before laying down the cork bed. With one side down, I'll measure and mark out the centre point for the second line so that I can keep the spacing the same across the full length. The second strip of cork is then glued in place before everything is held down with weights to dry. Meanwhile, I can make a start on the curves for the left-hand side of the layout. To get nice smooth curves, you can see I'm using the very high-tech method of using a pencil and string to mark these out. PVA is then added to the surface, but I can still just about see the marks through the glue. With the cork cut into 2 strips again, the outer side is laid using the markings as a guide for the centre line. The inner section can then be laid too, again using the mark as a guide and butting right up to the first section of cork. The whole process is then repeated again for the inside loop. While I wait for those to dry, I can get on with soldering the feeder wires to the track. In my instance, the black wire always goes to the inside rail on the circuit, while the red wire goes to the outer rail. It doesn't really matter which way round you do it, as long as you're consistent across the entire layout. Believe me, I've been caught out a few times as a result of having the track flipped over like this while soldering. And here's a closer look at how the joiner sleeper goes on the end to fit in where the final sleeper was removed. The track is then put in place and connected up to the points from the junction. And you can see I'm just adjusting the spacing of that final sleeper here. This will be held in place eventually by the glue I use while ballasting. The frontmost section of track is connected up too, and now I can start fixing these 2 sections in place. Just beyond this section before the curve starts is one final point which will lead into the shunting yard. So as before, I need to drill holes for both the operating rod from the motor and also the frog feed too. Double-sided tape is then once again added so that the point can be fixed in place. When bending the track for the curves, obviously the inside rail ends up being slightly longer than the outside rail, so here I'm just using the Dremel to trim off the excess. With the feeder wires soldered on, I can then start laying the 2 sections of track around the curves. Now, at the risk of boring you all to tears with yet more track laying, here you can see the 2 completed circuits with all the track across the rear of the layout now in place. You may notice the slight curve here, which is for where the bridge on the upper level will cross over the main line. And right at the back we also have another point which will eventually form the start of the reversing loop. So far all this is looking really good. But none of it works yet, as there's still one major step I need to do before I can start running trains. So I hope, like me, you're really excited for the series ahead, and if you just can't wait to see what happens next, well, episode 2 is available to watch right now for channel members. Members will be getting early access to all of the videos in this series, as well as some bonus content too, which I'm really excited about, and that's not going to be available anywhere else. If you click the join button below this video, you can see a list of all of the perks you get on the different levels. Don't worry, it doesn't take any money from you until you're absolutely certain that you want to join up. And even then, it only costs £1.99, so less than the price of a coffee, and you can come and be part of our awesome community. I hope I'll see some of you in the members area really soon, and now let's get back to the layout. Underneath the baseboard, you can see I have all the feeder wires from my track poking through, but these are yet to be connected up to anything. In a vague attempt at keeping things tidy, I'll start off by adding some adhesive clips to the underside of the board. My bus wires can then be run around the entire board, allowing me to distribute power to all parts of the layout. Teton will be controlled via DCC, so all the track will be live and I don't need to worry about any isolating sections, at least for the moment. Right now it's just a case of connecting all the red feeders to the main red wire and all the black feeders to the main black wire. These splice connectors are really handy for this job, and I put a link to them in the description along with everything else I've been using in this video too. With everything now wired up, I just need to install the control system itself, which for this layout is going to be a DCC EX system. This is an Arduino-based system which allows you to control your trains from your phone, and I've also got a little 3D printed case for it too so that I can mount it to the underside. With the positions for the screws marked out, I'll quickly drill a pilot hole for each one. Then with the control box back in place, I can attach it to the underside of the board. The final step is to connect the bus wires to the output on the controller and also plug in the transformer. All being well, we should now be able to run some trains, so let's find out if it's all gone to plan. So here we are, we have trains running on the layout for the very first time. Even though this is just two simple circuits, I have to admit I'm really glad it's all working. The great thing as well is that it seems like the locos are coping okay with those tight curves on the right hand side of the layout. I did have to make some adjustments, but they were relatively minor and so far nothing has derailed. It's all really smooth running as well, which I have to admit I'm very happy about. Previous layouts that I built in N-Gauge or even 009 took a lot more work to get running this smoothly, so I'm really pleased that I seem to have managed it first go with TT. This to me is one of the big advantages of the scale, as while it's smaller than 00, it's a lot more robust than N-Gauge. With the smaller scales, 0.5 millimeter can really make a big difference, but TT does seem to be that much easier to achieve smooth running with. The other thing, of course, is that even with these two long trains, they don't dominate the entire layout. Trains like these would be much longer in 00 gauge and would definitely feel more cramped unless they had a really big layout to run on. So another win for TT there. Of course, this is just the initial part of the build and my very first steps into this new scale, but there is a lot more to come over the next few months as I get this layout exhibition ready. If you want to keep up to date with the progress on this layout, then make sure you hit the subscribe button below this video, and don't forget, if you're a channel member, you can watch episode 2 right now. And just to keep things interesting, here's a little taster of what's coming up. I lay more track, install the point motors, and test out the reversing loop.